Thank you. Well, I have to admit that the hunger session has fallen to me, so I hope to be as brief as possible with this. I also have to start with an apology, which is that when I put my abstract in, I had very little idea what I was going to talk about. So consequently, my talk will drift slightly from the abstract, particularly because with recent data, what I'm going to try and do is put the Mediterranean range edge context or range edge situation into a more biogeographical context, but using population level data. And I'm going to do this focusing on two species. Both are widespread species that occur from the northern regions of Europe down to range edges in the Mediterranean. And that's Fagus sylvatica, the European beech tree, and Pinus sylvestris, or otherwise known as Scots pine. So it'll be a combination of some observational data and also some experimental work towards the second part of the talk. Well, in terms of context, it should come as no surprise to any of us to see figures such as this in a global change-themed conference, indicating that we're in a situation where we're in a period of rapid environmental change, and one that's really exceptional when set against the recent period. And furthermore, that this change is likely to continue and actually indeed to worsen according to recent predictions. But of course, these are describing changes in mean conditions, and superimposed upon that, we have changes in the frequency of extreme events. And these are being witnessed at the regional, if not at the global level. And of course, these combine to impose very significant pressures on natural populations and human populations and the populations that we depend on for goods and services across the globe. So in the context of a rapidly changing climate, we have the expectation, and indeed based on a lot of work looking at species biogeographies, that we have limitations to species ranges frequently through abiotic limitations, both at their leading and retreating range edge. And when we have a shift in climate in space, as we are undergoing at present, we have the expectation that this will displace the climate to which species are adapted to, leading to declines in fitness at retreating range edges and increases in fitness at expanding range edges. And the overall expectation is that this will lead to substantial shifts in species distributions. So here, this is just some work summarizing expected changes in a suite of North American tree species from some of Xavier Marin's work. But the overall expectation then is that we will have a general pattern of polewood expansion and equatorial decline. And that's evident in this figure based on the red zones in the southern margins of these species ranges where we forecast extinctions, and the darker green expanding areas of species ranges towards the poles. Well, bringing it a bit closer to home in terms of looking at European species and data that we have from those, we can scale back from those predictions at the range level to actually look at what's going on in range edge populations. And when we do that, we find that there's a significant amount of evidence looking at case studies on individual populations or altitudinal gradients where we see declines at species range edges. And this is data for Fagus sylvatica based on tree ring data, where we see a decline over the recent period just here. These are basal area increment data, and the null expectation is that we would have a stable level of growth rather than a decline in recent years. And this is linked in this region, or in these regions, to the diverging trends of temperature and precipitation. So we have precipitation in the lower graph, temperature in the upper graph, and this is taken from the meteorological station in the westernmost of these two sites. The overall result of this is that we see decline of individuals, retreat of species range edges, very much as predicted. And although I present data here for Fagus sylvatica, or present studies here for Fagus sylvatica, we see this in a range of other species at the Mediterranean range edge. So this all seems to fit very neatly with the predictions from bioclimatic models in terms of what's going on. And based on the work that we'd been doing, looking at growth decline and response to changing conditions in this population, we moved on to do a whole suite of other types of investigation, looking at both genetic impacts, ecological impacts, demographic impacts, both of changing environmental conditions in terms of climate, but also looking at impacts of increased levels of habitat fragmentation as the range retreats. Well, what became an ever-increasing concern based on work in this single altitudinal gradient in the Mont Cenis Mountains was really the question that by concentrating on changes in responsive range edge populations, have we really lost the ability to see the wood for the trees? And apologies to those of you not familiar with this pun. What we're really talking about here is have we ceased to be able to see the bigger picture by concentrating so much on these particular populations? And I stress responsive as well in this situation, because of course nobody is particularly interested in publishing studies in populations where everything is doing just fine. So we have a significant publication bias that needs to be taken into account when we're looking at data taken from population-level case studies along the retreating range edge of species distributions. If we step up then to the broadest context that we possibly can do and look at the global context, we see that drought-related impacts or drought-related dieback impacts are reported globally. You don't need to note the detail in this figure, but just to see that we get these types of very large-scale drought-related dieback events worldwide. And these may be either directly caused through drought or through pest outbreaks associated with exacerbated drought. And when we look at these in the context of range changes, we find an interesting pattern, which is that range expansions are commonly recorded, and here we're looking at latitudinal range expansions. We also get frequent reports of altitudinal range shifts, so declines at the lower altitudinal range edge and expansion at the upper range edge. And these regional patterns that we see can be very, very extensive. But what we find much, much, much less evidence of is latitudinal range retractions in the literature. Things seem to be going up in altitude at the lower range edge, but they don't seem to be retracting towards the poles in terms of their latitudinal range edges. And this presents a little bit of a problem when we try and tie these types of observations together with predictions from bioclimatic models. And looking a bit more broadly in terms of the literature, we see that now we have increasing attention turned to this sort of issue. That we've noticed that there are mismatches between predictions and observations. In part, this is now known to be due to individualistic responses, both regionally and between species. But we also find that we get some quite surprising predictions made, some of which are implying that we may get range edge persistence and also indications that we may additionally get preferential decline in core regions of species distributions. So it all turns out to be much more complicated than one might expect based on looking at a simple bioclimatic model predicting changes in distribution at fairly coarse scales. So to try and bring some of these predictions down to the population level, we turned to using the good old-fashioned method of using tree core data to try and understand how growth was changing and how climate sensitivity was changing across a species range. And this is a sampling network of Fagus sylvatica populations from the north of the UK, in the north of this species distribution, right the way down to its southernmost populations down in Spain, just over here. And in order to understand how climate and growth fitted together at the regional level, we conducted analyses based on grouping sites together, both in terms of their climatic similarity and then understanding whether that climatic similarity also meshed with the response similarity of these individual sites. This is one approach. I stress that we're also looking at an individual-based approach, but I'll present the regional study here. And if we look at sensitivity to growth, so here we have sensitivity to impacts of drought or high temperatures. Under this model of a shifting species distribution, we have a fairly simple prediction, and that is that we should have low sensitivity to drought and high temperatures at the northern range edge, and also that we should have very high sensitivity to drought and high temperatures at the southern range edge. We should see a predictable increase between these 2 points. So looking at the regional-based assessment of tree core data in terms of looking at climate growth relationships, so here we're really looking at sensitivity to particular climate drivers of growth, we find the expected pattern at the northern range edge, which is up here, with very little agreement between individual sites and very little sensitivity to climate. So I stress here we have temperature on the left, precipitation on the right, and we're really moving down through the species distribution, down through the figure here. Across the base, we have the months of growth from the previous year into the current year. And what you notice is that we get very high sensitivity to growth, high sensitivity to, I'll give up on the pointer, temperature and precipitation in the core areas of the species range. Oddly, we're not finding that pattern at these southern range edges. So when we summarize that into a conceptual figure just to look at the pattern that we do find in terms of the climate growth response, we find that we're getting actually much greater sensitivity to climatic drivers in the core area of the species distribution rather than at this southern range edge. So again, this contrasts with the predictions that we would make. Rather than looking at sensitivity, we can actually look at the growth response of tree species to climatic drivers. And again, what we predict here is that we would have an increase in growth at the northern limit, a decrease in growth at the southern limit. So declining growth trends at the south, increasing growth trends at the north, assuming that the species range, climatic range is shifted. These are data using basal area increment data. Now, all you need to know about this is it's basically the amount of stem area a tree puts on each year. And this is directly related to the canopy of a tree. So if the canopy is reducing, the stem area is reducing. If the canopy is reducing, that's indicative of declining health, declining growth, declining productivity. And we see at the northern range edge, we get a very clear increase in growth over time. No particular indications of any significant climatic impacts on that. We get a similar increase over time in the core areas of the species distribution, but with really marked impacts of particular climatic events. And the two big depressions that you see in those core areas of the species range are due to the 1976 and 2003 droughts. But again, what I want you to concentrate on is really what's going on at the southern edge of the species range here. And what we find in this case is that we really get very little evidence of any decline at all. And what we see instead is really a pattern of stable growth over time. So no declining growth trend at the southern edge of the species range. And again, this is very much different from the predictions that we have in terms of how we would expect growth to respond. So we can move on from looking at growth to try and understand, well, what happens in a particular year given that we have a particular driver of growth depression. And we can characterize this in terms of resistance to drought, which we can do by looking at particularly poor years of growth associated with particular depressions in the drought index, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. And then we can calculate resistance and use generalized additive modeling to try and understand the drivers behind the change in resistance that we see according to particular drivers. When we do this, again, the southern range edge of the species stands out as particularly interesting. And there I want you to look at the middle figure towards the left, where you see this very big peak with a very large contribution of latitudes to explaining the variation in resistance that we have there. So it seems to be that these southern range edge populations are particularly resistant to climate-driven growth decline. And interestingly, in this case, we find the lowest resistance in what we expect to be the least impacted areas, which are those in the south of the UK. And we've done some work looking at the impact of extreme events in this area and how variation between individuals goes on to have a community-level impact. But I'm not going to talk about that here. I want to concentrate on this Mediterranean border. So what we see then with the Fagus sylvatica range-wide assessment is that using these population-level data and combining them into a regional assessment, we see that populations at both poleward and equatorial range edges really show highly individualistic climate growth responses. But whereas we see a strong increase in growth in the north of the species range, very much in line with model predictions, we don't see the predicted growth decline at the southern range edge. Indeed, we see very high resistance to growth decline at the southern range edge of this species distribution. And it appears from other work that we're doing and from other literature-based work that we have this significant disconnect going on at the southern range edge due to a combination of different factors. One of these is that we know that we have pronounced local adaptation occurring at the southern range edge, and we know this from a very wide variety of provenance trials, which are essentially reciprocal transplant experiments where trees are taken from different parts of the species range and grown in other areas. But also we know that we tend to get the occurrence of relict populations at the southern range edge, or the equatorial range edge of species distributions. And these relict populations are populations that are occurring in habitats that are buffered from surrounding regional climates. So we have situations where we have local climates, which are the climates, of course, to which the individuals respond, that are buffered from the regional climate. So particular pockets of humidity in otherwise dry environments would be an example of this. Overall, then, this has consequences for what we understand both in terms of distribution modeling, but also in terms of assessment of extinction, regional biodiversity patterns. In terms of the fact that what we expect to see, and what indeed we are seeing, is rather than range retractions, we're seeing range fragmentation and a shift from commonness to rarity at the edge of species ranges, rather than a particular pattern of absolute species loss. And this really complicates predictions of range retractions, but it also, of course, has community-level consequences, because in many occasions we're looking at species that play very important roles in shaping communities. We're not looking at an individual species-level effect, but one that has a knock-on effect for the variety of plants, animals, fungi that depend on these species that are retained despite predictions of retraction. So to step then from this broad scale level to try and understand just how this can occur at the population level, we've actually been forced to switch species and to look at another species that we're doing quite a lot of experimental work on at the moment. It's the other widespread species that I mentioned, the Scots pine, Pinus sylvestris. And one of the reasons for this is the fact that Fagus sylvatica is not great for experimental work in controlled conditions. But we expect the same, the results of this to be broadly comparable. And so what we've been doing using Pinus sylvestris collections is to take amalgamated population-level samples from the northern and southern species range edge and to take random samples of seed from these to represent a kind of generalized range edge populations and subject these to fully multifactorial drought and precipitation and provenance treatments run in controlled environment conditions in growth chambers at the University of Stirling. And the predicted climates that we've been subjecting these to are those according to what are now actually past IPCC scenarios for the coming century. Two types of experiment. First, a chronic drought experiment where we reduce watering, and then a subsequent acute drought experiment where we have watering stopped altogether with a subset where we have a sporadic precipitation event to look at recovery. And we've been looking at traits in terms of emergence, survival, both total biomass gained and the way that biomass is allocated, and then to get some idea in terms of physiology by looking at carbon isotope discrimination. Very quickly, in terms of the results that we get from this, we find that, that at low temperatures we don't really find any difference between the two range edges. But under southern temperatures, so both predicted and future temperatures, we get significantly elevated survival in these southern range edge population samples. When we look at growth and allocation, we find that in the northern sites we get boosted growth in response to increased temperatures. We also find that the seedlings from the southern range really grow better than the northern ones across the board. I stress that we're looking really at changes at the southern range edge conditions and comparing those with the north. We're not looking at the particular factors that may be limiting northern range edge populations. We're really interested here on understanding what's going on at the southern range edge. And this increase in growth and overall biomass that we see at the southern range edge appears to be linked to the higher investment in biomass, particularly in roots, both in terms of root length and also in terms of root biomass. So this is in response to chronic drought, but then in terms of acute drought, if we have much deeper roots, does this lead individuals to be much more resistant to droughts going on at the equatorial range edge, where we have very prolonged periods of drought, prolonged periods with no precipitation? Looking at the acute drought experiment, we do indeed find that we get range edge populations having much greater survival under elevated temperature and low water availability. We get an effect of a single sporadic rainfall event in the fact that this will double survival, but it's particularly notable that these southern range edge populations really do much better under future conditions. And in terms of the low water availability treatment there, you see under future conditions we get no survival at all in the northern populations. When we look at allocation and water use, we see that we get clear evidence. So this is you're looking at the rightmost bars in the upper figure here. We get clear evidence of adaptation to acute drought at the equatorial or southern range edge. with these southern populations gaining much greater biomass. They have greater survival, and generally this appears to be linked to the greater root-shoot ratio. By looking at the isotopic discrimination using carbon isotope data, one of the mechanisms for this really seems to be that the southern individuals are managing through this higher root investment to maintain open stomata, to maintain their growth, despite the very high levels of water loss that they're experiencing under both current and future temperatures. So in summary then, looking at the Pinus sylvestris work, we see that we get the individuals at the southern range edge, so these generic southern range edge populations, much better able to resist drought-induced cessation of growth. They gain more biomass. They have much greater survival probability. And it seems that one of the key traits here is investment in roots that allows them to function at much lower levels of water availability. And this is particularly important in terms of resistance to acute drought, or the types of drought that we would expect to see in the areas that these populations come from. So in summary then, and trying to wrap this up and give you some take-home messages from the talk as a whole, putting together both the experimental and observational work, and back in terms of the context of those predictions based on bioclimatic models that we started with. We have to understand that bioclimatic models usually use very coarse resolution climatic data, or not very coarse resolution data, but data that are more coarse than the population level. And of course, individual populations are responding to their local climate, not the climate of the region, which is typically what's being used to model changes to an overall species distribution. We know that local adaptation and differential habitat use, both in core and peripheral regions, can really complicate our ability to forecast change. And that's because populations will be lost from some habitats but not others, and consequently the use of habitat then becomes extremely important, and how that varies across a species range. And I stress here it's not that local adaptation occurs necessarily, it's really the fact that we don't really understand how local adaptation differs between these range edge populations, because we just simply don't have the data for that. So understanding how one population may respond in comparison with another then becomes very difficult. And it's this local level resolution we really need if we're to look at changes in the range edge distribution, but also in terms of local biodiversity patterns. And these types of issues really are a particular issue at the equatorial or southern range edge in the northern hemisphere. And this is because many species predominantly occur in their most resistant habitats in these areas. And we know this based on a large amount of data looking at a wide variety of species, from invertebrates through to plant species, where we get both relict populations occurring but also relict species in the Mediterranean region. And these are both populations and species that have survived pronounced climatic shifts in the past, sometimes leading to species dating back to much more humid, warmer periods in the tertiary that have survived in particular local habitats in the Mediterranean region to the present day. In order to take this and actually to expand upon this type of information, what we really desperately need is both greater understanding of local adaptation, but also greater understanding of environmental buffering. So the persistence and the formation of these relict populations. And we need this both for understanding resource use for us as humans, but also the response prediction of species and communities within particular areas. And I stress we cannot hope really to forecast extinctions effectively in these retreating range edges and retreating zones, bioclimatic zones, until we get much, much better resolution data from those retreating range edges. And that resolution of that data really must be at the population level rather than the regional level as it is at present. Thank you.